Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, our guest of the day, Charlie Faulkner, used to be a member of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. Many were surprised he agreed to serve as Shadow Justice Secretary. After all, he and Mr Corbyn come from very different places in the Labour Party. Then, last June, after a year in post, he resigned, along with 18 of his cabinet colleagues, warning that Labour would be left for dead if it failed to unite and address voters' concerns. So how does Tony Blair's former flatmate feel about Labour's prospects now? How do you feel? Have you changed your mind? Have you had to review your thoughts and feelings about Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, he's the leader of the Labour Party.
I know that.
And we are absolutely committed as a party to doing our best to win this general election.
But you haven't changed your personal view about Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I think he's performing incredibly well in the course of this general election, and indeed the comparison between him and Theresa May is very, very marked. He is calm and clear and brave and is, I think, connecting, particularly with young people and particularly with people who haven't voted before. I mentioned it before in the programme. It was very interesting to see the response he got as he arrived at the Cambridge debate yesterday.
But there are still big policy differences between you and him and his supporters. You supported the war in Iraq, a war Jeremy Corbyn opposed and has said was illegal. Last week, in a speech days after the Manchester attack, he suggested it contributed to the risk of terror attacks here in the UK. Do you accept that?
I don't think the attacks in Manchester were caused by either the Iraq war or anything that the British government did.
So you disagree with Jeremy Corbyn on that?
I think in relation to that there would be a difference of emphasis, yes.
Right, because he said that the foreign policy of Tony Blair and other governments, but that was obviously the government you were part of, is in some way linked to at least being a recruiting sergeant for people that then go on to commit attacks.
Yeah, and he has said that. I think we would both be, that's Jeremy and I, completely united in saying it was an abomination what happened in Manchester, and we would both
Everyone agrees that.
And we'd also agree two other things. First of all, that if and insofar as the security services, the police, the army and the intelligence services need additional resources, they should be provided.
Fine.
And secondly, we also agree that in relation to measures anti-terrorist in legislation, there should be appropriate judicial oversight. But I think so. We would be.
But you didn't vote against the terrorist legislation, even in and he did. He voted against every single one. And was he right to do that?
Well, I think he was wrong in relation to particular issues in relation to that. But he's made clear subsequently that he's not against the state having those powers.
But he voted against every single piece of legislation that's been passed.
Because he says that he thinks that there was inadequate judicial oversight.
Right. I mean, he voted against, for example, lots of organisations that many people would consider pretty dreadful, being prescribed organisations. Was he right?
Well, we obviously disagreed at the time. The question now is, do I agree? I mean, it's not a question of any interest to the electorate, but in terms of what's my position in relation to the Labour manifesto, I support the Labour manifesto. Was
it appropriate for Jeremy Corbyn to make that political speech so soon after the Manchester attack?
I mean, it's right that he should express his views in relation to it. He has got to be straightforward with the British public and they've got to make a judgment about that. I do not think it is wrong on an issue of such grievous significance to the nation, namely the abominable attacks in Manchester, that the Leader of the Opposition in the middle of an election campaign should not set out what his views are. I think he was right to do so.
Right, let's talk about the nuclear deterrent. It's very clear, Jeremy Corbyn's position, but he has said that if he becomes Prime Minister, his Labour government will conduct a comprehensive defence review, and that would also take into account the renewal of the Trident nuclear deterrent, which, of course, Mr Corbyn is very clear he doesn't support and therefore could once again be in doubt. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, my understanding is that the review will not consider the question of whether or not Trident continues.
No, that is not clear, Charlie Faulkner, because it will include everything. That's what Jeremy Corbyn has said, and he's the leader of the party.
Well, I'm relying on what Nia Griffiths said.
So you think the Shadow Defence, or she was the Shadow Defence spokesman, has a clearer view than the leader of the Labour Party?
Well, my understanding is that it's accepted by the leader of the Labour Party, that Trident is accepted by the Labour Party, and that is what the manifesto says.
In a recent interview, my colleague Andrew Neil said, will the defence review that you want to call if you become Prime Minister, will that include Trident? Jeremy Corbyn, it will look at the role of nuclear weapons as it will look at everything. So that means it will be included.
Well, we can debate the small print. My position is that I'm in favour of retaining Trident. That is the position of the Labour Party in terms of policy. I understand Jeremy Corbyn accepts that. So I do not think there is a difference between us, despite what you're saying to me.
Right. The public record suggests that during the Troubles, Jeremy Corbyn met members of the IRA, which I'm sure you know, on several occasions. He says he was working for peace rather than honouring the armed struggle. But Seamus Mallon, one of the architects of the peace process, says he never heard anyone mention Corbyn at all in the peace process, and that he very clearly took the side of the IRA, and that was incompatible with working for peace. In your mind, because you know Jeremy Corbyn, you've known him for a long time, did he play a role in the peace process?
Well, I don't know in relation to any of that. I'm absolutely sure that Jeremy wanted peace, so I can't comment on the detail of any of that.
Right. Let's have a look at some of the domestic policy. You called the idea of bringing the national grid into public ownership going too far, saying it would involve vast expenditure when there are so many other things we should be spending money on. You say you're supporting the whole Labour manifesto, so you've changed your mind.
Well, I support the thrust of the manifesto. The precise detail of whether or not the national grid...
This is not a detail, this is a big policy, isn't it? Renationalising utilities.
Yeah, and in relation to, for example, the renational of the railways, I'd be strongly in favour of that. But in terms of...
Are you in favour of public ownership of the national grid?
I think it may well be that's something for much, much later. I wouldn't necessarily be in favour of it straight away.
Right. I mean, all the polling companies have Labour on a higher share of the vote than they scored at the 2015 general election. So despite all the warnings from you and others in the past, it suggests Jeremy Corbyn is more popular with the public than Ed Miliband. Does that surprise you?
I think the public have gone through quite a long journey, and what they're thinking at the moment is it's a choice between the Tories and Labour and what life would be like. And people remember how bad things have been in the 80s under the Tories, and this government has been in power effectively for 7 years, and they are absolutely fed up with the continuation of unnecessary austerity.
Does it surprise you that Jeremy Corbyn could poll better in terms of national vote share than Ed Miliband?
No, it doesn't, because the choice as it emerged in this election was not ultimately about Brexit, because I think people think we've made our decision as a country about Brexit. The choice is between Theresa May leading the Tory party and Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party, and I think the public are now making up their mind which of the two they want. And the other interesting thing that's happened in the election is the smaller parties have got pushed to the side.
Right. Let's
it's
look
a big
just
epochal
very
choice.
Quickly, because we're coming up to the end of the programme, tuition fees, the manifesto commitment, £11 billion to abolish tuition fees. You, of course, were part of the government that introduced it. Is that the right policy, to abolish them?
Well, I think you need to look to see whether the effect on the public finances. That's been done, and looking at the effect on the public finances, it's a possible policy. So I'm not opposed to it being part of the overall package.
All right, Charlie Faulkner.